Welcome back, everybody. We hope that you've been enjoying our deep dive so far. Up now, we have Kevin. He's going to be doing his talk on design docs, the blueprint your pipeline needs. So the stage is all yours now, Kevin.
Thank you. Hello. So today I want to drive home the importance of documentation. It's very exciting, I know. But before that, I'm sure the question on everybody's mind is, who is this guy? Who am I? Well, I'm Batman. I'm just kidding. I'm actually Kevin Aston, by day, Batman by night. And I'm the founder and creative director of Foxwork Productions. That is a company that I founded. I came up with the name when I was 6, which is why it's kind of dumb, but that's fine. We're working on our debut title, Secrets of the Burrow Victoria's Quest, which is a 3D platformer where you play as a princess and a knight as you go on a cozy action adventure through an ancient, mysterious forest, and you uncover some secrets. In the industry, I've done everything from QA to design. So I've done QA, concept art, some 3D modeling, production, and game design, of course. Some of my games, so I've worked on very big games like Cyberpunk. I've worked on some medium games like The Quarry, and some very small games like Goddess. Outside of gaming, I'm a writer and illustrator, so I've written and illustrated some children's books and a short novella. And then in terms of education, I've had the, I would say, pleasure and absolute chance to learn from some industry legends. So Brian Orguy, I'm sure you all know from Insomnia Games, creative director on the Ratchet & Clank series. Lorne Nudo is a lead writer at Ubisoft. His most recent work was Assassin's Creed Mirage, Valley of Dreams, if I'm not mistaken. And then Mike Matese is an ex-Disney animator who's worked on movies like The Lion King, but he's also worked in the games industry many years ago as a concept artist and an art director, most notably on Leapfrog Games. He was the art director there. So with that being said, let's get into the talk. So the reason I want to talk about this is because there's a hidden bottleneck, especially amongst indie teams. You know, most indie teams obsess over the right engine or the right art pipeline, the right project management tools. But there's a hidden bottleneck in plain sight, which is nobody really knows what you're actually building. And it's not because your team is incompetent. It's mostly because design decisions either live in your head, they get lost in Discord messages, or they exist in a kind of a we'll figure it out later, we'll figure it out as we go kind of mentality. And that's not really a pipeline, and it can cause a lot of issues. So today's goal, I want to go over why documentation is infrastructure, not overhead, how wikis can help prevent the restart cycle that kill most indie games. And I have some templates that you can use today, tomorrow, as soon as you get them, that will help you streamline not only your production, but also your team. So the real cost of no documentation. I want to tell you a story about a studio I worked at. So we had a well-known director who preferred not to work with any kind of formal documentation of any kind, especially not design. And it was often very chaotic. You know, the team would build features based on last week's discussion or a conversation they had in the kitchen, only to find that the direction had shifted. So what happened was we'd rebuild and then we'd rebuild again, sometimes scrapping months of work just entirely just out the window. And that resulted in an environment that, you know, it was an environment of constant reinvention with team members either trying to put out fires or try to keep working despite them. So it wasn't the best place to work. And the reality for teams is that this story highlights a fundamental problem, which is when teams work based on assumptions. So when knowledge lives only in people's heads, transmitting the information from one brain to another gets messy. And it gets even messier the further down the line you go. So, you know, you'd have programmers implementing last week's vision artists creating assets from a discussion they had 2 weeks ago, designers communicating this week's vision. Nobody has a single source of truth, and no one really knows what they need to build. And if experienced directors can create this kind of chaos with no documentation, an indie teams don't really stand a chance. So a lack of documentation causes a lot of miscommunication. So when you do document, you minimize miscommunication and misinterpretation. The other thing that documentation does is it helps you communicate properly, which will help you avoid all of these hidden costs. So we have rework. You build the wrong thing and then you have to rebuild it again. That can take up 20-40% of development time. That's wasted. Context switching, constant how does this work interruptions, and those can end up being 15-20 minute conversations that make you lose out on productivity. Scope creep, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with, features that don't serve the core vision get worked on for weeks, but then they don't make the cut. Team friction, so disagreements on what was agreed upon, what was talked about, when people have different memories of things, that can build tension. And then there's onboarding hell. New team members cannot get up to speed, not quickly at least. It can take days or weeks to transfer this knowledge that's spread across Discord, WhatsApp messages, kind of all over the place. So it gets very hard. But when you document your entire game or your design, you're trying to promote proper communication. And what I'm very big on going from poor communication up to excellent communication. And that is what this whole talk is about. And I want to draw a comparison to the construction industry because I believe that they've cracked it. They know exactly what they're doing. So if we look at construction, we have architects, builders, and the blueprints. So the architects, they create detailed blueprints before any construction begins. They specify materials, dimensions, structures. They think about how the space will be used. The builders, they read the blueprints, bring them to life, handle technical implementation, and actually build the building itself. And then the blueprint is the shared language between the two. It's a single source of truth, and it can catch a lot of problems early on. So in games, that's your designer, your programmer, and your design document. And it's the same thing. The designer comes up with the game's design, how things should work, how things should interact. Your programmer handles the technical implementations. How will this actually work? How can it work? How will the systems speak to each other? And your design document is your shared language. It's where you can both go to. It's your source of truth, and you can both discuss based off of the document. So, why do blueprints matter in construction, for example? Well, without blueprints, builders will just guess at intent. Mistakes are very expensive to fix. You can't work in parallel. You can't onboard new contractors. There's no quality control. Whereas with blueprints, everyone knows the plan right from the start because the blueprints have been done. Changes can be documented. Quality control is possible. And you can predict a good budget and timeline if you have a plan set out. So there's an insane alternative to not having blueprints, which would be, if you imagine an architect just says, we're building a house, just start laying bricks and I'll tell you where the bathroom goes. The contractor will obviously ask, but where do the load bearing walls go? What's the electrical plan? And the architect will reply, we'll figure it out as we go, just stay agile. This would be insane. No contractor would accept this job. And if they did, you'd end up with a house that looks like this, which is not ideal. In game development, it's the same thing. If a designer says we're making a roguelite, just start coding. And the program asks, but what's the core loops? What systems interact? How should things work? And the designer just replies, we'll figure it out, just start building. You'll end up with a game like this. And in the games industry, it's something that we kind of accept, or it's been accepted a lot, where we can just build games like this in a very improvisational way. But it does cause a lot of issues and a lot of headaches and bloated development time, bloated budget. Everything just kind of explodes and expands. because documentation, what it does is it prevents expensive mistakes. So in construction, moving a wall on a blueprint costs nothing, whereas moving a wall after it's been built, I mean, that costs thousands. And in game development, changing a system in documentation can take you 5 minutes. Changing it after code, art, and levels of code can take days or weeks or months even. And the earlier you catch the problem, the cheaper they are to fix. And documentation lets you catch those problems very early on in the design phase. And that's the cheapest possible time you can catch them. So the lesson here is, if experienced teams create communication problems without documentation, then indie teams really don't stand a chance. And the thing is that documentation isn't about constraining creativity at all. It's about enabling execution. You have brilliant ideas, your team wants to execute them, and documentation is the bridge between the two. It helps you create flow within your development, especially when you reach the production phase and you come out of prototyping and you start to really define what you're going to make. So the restart problem, this is quite a big problem, and it comes mainly from a lack of documentation. So I'm sure you've all seen this, but there are countless YouTube videos titled "I Restarted My Game." And this highlights the most commonly experienced failure pattern in indie development games, which is the restart cycle. You build for months, realize systems don't fit, or something's not working, or it doesn't fit your idea, and so you start over doing it right this time. So this more often than not fails for the same reason the first attempt did. You haven't captured why decisions are being made, or what was learned, or how systems should interact. So 6 months from now, you just hit the same wall. Why did I design it this way? This doesn't work with my new feature. I guess I'll just restart. And the cycle just continues. Because if you're not documenting, if you're not laying out, and if you're not learning from your mistakes, then you're bound to repeat them. And a common excuse you hear to this is that games are about iteration. So it's okay to fail over and over again and to try and try again. The issue is that iteration isn't about trying 50 different ideas. It's about refining a single core idea 50 times. And there's a lot of misinterpretation there. And so I think it's important to clear up. If you're trying a bunch of different things and nothing's working, that's not iteration. Those are, like I said, 50 new ideas. So some developers try to fix the lack of documentation by creating a massive 100-page or more game design document. The issue with this is that it lacks practical utility. It becomes very overwhelming to write and to read. It's immediately outdated because the design changes and no one wants to scroll through 300 pages to find the one they need to update. And it quickly becomes untrusted. No one looks at it. Everyone knows it's wrong. Everyone knows it's out of date. So for example, the programmer might need 3 paragraphs about the jump mechanic, but has to scroll through 80 pages of story and UI design just to find it. And when production ramps up and your design changes because your prototype taught you new things, you're kind of back to square one because no one updates this thing. And then you just go back to working off of memory or asking people in Discord, and it just gets messy all over again. So the solution that I found is wikis. So I believe that modular documentation, so wikis built in Notion, Confluence, or some organized Google Docs, is the best approach for not only indie teams, but teams in general. Personally and professionally, I use Notion. That's what I prefer. So instead of just having one giant document, what you end up having is interconnected pages. So 1 page per feature, 1 page per system. They're all linked together. And by structuring documentation as pages rather than just one giant document, it makes knowledge accessible and maintainable. So the reason I truly think this approach is game-changing, and it's nothing new, a lot of people are doing it, but you have focused access. So if someone needs a jump mechanic, they can go to that page. You can link them to that page. There's no scrolling through unrelated content. Very easy to update. The jump mechanic changes. You update the one page. Again, there's a link. You don't need to hunt through a massive document just to find it. And it allows parallel work. So multiple people can be assigned different pages that will be maintained individually. And it's great for part-time teams, as I'll speak about in a minute. So trying to cram your entire game into one enormous document can be intimidating. As I mentioned, intimidating to write, intimidating to read, and it also comes with a huge amount of downsides. It's also very hard to navigate. Whereas the wiki is modular, so you can write it in smaller chunks, so it's easier for you to write. You can assign out single pages, removing the intimidating fact of having to read or go through a huge document. And you can make sure your team is focused on their tasks. So no one gets distracted, no one's scrolling down to, again, the jump mechanic, and they get distracted reading the narrative. There's none of that. They have a page, they live in that page. So my current reality is that I run a team of 4 part-time developers across different time zones, and we're all working on Secrets of the Burrow. And without documentation, this would have been impossible. It would have been a nightmare. And I have a rule at FBP: if there isn't a design doc, it doesn't get made, and that is a hard rule. There's no exceptions there. If we're not documenting the plan, we're not making anything. The reason for this is because without documentation, our Discord would have been a graveyard of long, messy threads. Like how does stamina work, followed by 15 messages back and forth, only for someone to ask the same question 2 weeks later. So every conversation just gets buried under a new conversation, and information just gets lost. And all this would have done, had we started with Discord, is that it would have led to poor communication, a lack of communication, especially when people start to feel self-conscious that they're asking the same thing 2, maybe 3 times. Not to mention, on the other end of that, extreme frustration when you need to reply to the same question 3-4 times in like the span of a month. And then confusion. That's a big one that I think kind of gets overlooked. But, people read messages that aren't for them, and it can just create kind of a confusion, and it just gets very messy. Now, for us, we use Notion right at the gate. And with Notion, with documentation, when someone asks me, for example, about the stamina system, I just send them the page. So the question's answered in like 5 seconds, not 5 minutes of back and forth on Discord. If someone has a comment, they comment on that page. Again, it's all contained in the one page. Someone's assigned a feature, they just live in that page for however long it takes them. If someone needs to step away for holidays or any other reasons, when they come back, the page is waiting for them. If it's needed updated, it's been updated. So everything's clean, everything's manageable, everything's findable. So documentation kind of kills the endless Discord threads and the endless back and forth. So it's all very nice me talking about documentation. But here's a real world example from our game. So in just 6 short months, we went from this very gray, very simple character and environment to this. And like I said, it was 6 short months. Most of that time was documentation done by myself. And what we were able to accomplish in such a short time is a lot, to be honest. We have 2 playable characters, each with their own unique abilities. We have our traversal system, which is very acrobatic, very Prince of Persia. We have our unique combat system, which you're seeing on screen now, which is it's a little hard to explain because it's truly, we haven't found a game that's done anything similar, but you're like a Beyblade. And we've also built an entire level all the way through to the final phase, which you're seeing here. So the full art pass, and then like another half level. And then we have another level that's just coming out of gray box. And that's because all of this was planned. And all of this was documented, and everyone knew what they were doing. And so the team could just come in and work. There was no questions, no loss of time. It was very lean, very efficient. So The other thing, very important, is that if you're a solo dev, you also need to document. I mean, you take breaks, you have other responsibilities. Sometimes future you won't remember what present you was thinking, like 6 months down the line. So you need to document for future you. And it also helps you stay on track, make sure that you're not adding features that don't need to be there, that you're not expanding your game to an unmanageable point. The other important thing, very important about documentation, is accountability. So if a document is created and your team or the parties involved approve it, then everyone's on the same page and you have a record of that. So when someone says, oh, I thought we were doing X, you can point to the document and say, no, we all agreed on Y. And this isn't about blaming people. It's about preventing the I thought we said statements or arguments. It's about removing friction. So documentation turns vague memories into concrete agreements, kind of like a contract. It also holds you accountable. So when you write down this feature will work in this way, you can't later claim you said differently, right? You've made a document. You might have changed your mind, but that's a whole other thing. But there's a document stating what the plan was. So you can't get mad at anyone. And for teams, it also means clear ownership. So who's responsible for this is answered by looking at the page owner if you're using Notion, for example. So accountability prevents scope creep and finger pointing, and documentation keeps everyone fair. So let's talk about what to document. It can be very overwhelming to look at a blank screen and realize that all your ideas need to leave the safety of your mind and take on like a structured, readable format. So I just want to go over 3 starter documents and a couple methodologies to get the ball rolling. And I'll be using our current game Secrets of the Burrow as an example. So getting started. Before we start documenting, I want to talk about how to document. So hierarchical thinking. This is something I learned from Mike Matesi, who I mentioned above. Now, he explained it in the context of art, but I think hierarchical thinking can help you in any creative project, period. So how does this work? So we have a hierarchical pyramid. This is roughly your project. And you want to start with your foundation. So you want to start with a core. What is the core of your feature or your mechanic or your game? How does it work at its most basic form? After that, you want to start getting specific. You want to start adding details. So you want to get into details of how your vision is going to work, what's it going to look like. And then finally, you want to start defining. You want to lock things down. You want to define it. You want to make it clear. And you want to push forward with that. So this is how we're going to structure all of our documents, especially the 3 that I'll show you today. So the first one is the game concept overview or the concept overview document. So even in a wiki, you need a North Star. So that's what the concept overview is. In our case, this sits as soon as you open up the Secrets of the Burrow wiki, this is what you see. It's the first thing. So this is your North Star. This needs to answer all your fundamental design questions and structure questions like what systems exist, how do they connect. It needs to be devoid of theming, and that's very important, and we'll get into why. And it needs to focus on the core structure. So this is your game's skeleton, right? Just your pure mechanical skeleton. So the way this document works is you start off with a short sentence or 2 that explains the core of your game. So in our case, it's the player will travel through levels connected to a hub, collecting different abilities along the way, returning to the hub after each level with a new ability will allow them to progress to the next. So there, as I mentioned before, there's no theming, but this is how the game's core loop will roughly work. You go to a level, you come back, you get an ability, come back to the hub, next level, hub, ability, hub, etc., etc. After you've done this, so this would, in our pyramid, this would be our core, this would be our base. Now you start detailing. So you talk about the heroes. So we have 2. They each have their own abilities. You talk about the hub. How is the hub going to work? In our case, it's mainly to transmit a narrative. Talk about the levels. How are the levels going to work? So here, for example, very important, we've defined that the levels will stream seamlessly. So that answers a question right off the bat. Loading screens, portals, how are we going to get from one place to another? It streams seamlessly. Player progression, again, talking about how you go from one level to the other, why you need to come back to the hub. It's a key and lock system. It's also defined there. And then after that, we start to define a bit. So we define our verbs. So what will the player do? Again, not specific, but the player will move, they'll collect, they'll fight, they'll push and pull stuff, they'll jump. We're starting to define what the player will actually be able to do. And then at the bottom, there's just a quick section for narrative, just for some context, because I know, at least from experience, when I come up with a game, I'm thinking of everything, not just how it works. I think of what characters will be in there, what the world's going to look like. So I like to have a little section here just for context. So once you've read the mechanical skeleton, you can add you can use your imagination to add a bit of context to how everything's going to look. So how do you use the concept overview document? Well, when someone suggests crafting, for example, you check the document and you go, does it use our verbs? Does it fit our progression? If the answer is no, then it gets cut. If the answer is yes, then you move on to documenting the mechanic or the feature. So the concept overview document also helps you decide what will and will not be made. So it's important that once the concept overview document has been made, you check it with your team to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So the document needs to be agreed upon and respected by everyone. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. The next document is the vision template. So the vision template, this one's probably a little more fun to make because where the concept overview was the what you're making, so the mechanics, again, very skeletal. The vision template is the why it matters and who it's for. So this is where you can start to include your theming, your narrative, your design pillars, and it's broken down roughly, into overview, target audience, key features, design pillars, and specifications. So for our game, as you can see, the overview, again, this would be the bottom of your pyramid. It's your core. So what's the overview? So it's a medieval fantasy about a proud knight who's sent to retrieve a princess who has run away from home. So then we have more story. We're fleshing that out. Then we go into a bit more what the game is. So the Secrets of the Bow is a 3D action platformer where you assume the role of the realm's strongest knight and his princess. Players will go on an adventure through a fantasy-filled medieval forest and watch as the two heroes go from adversaries to potential lovers. So this is kind of what would potentially go on the back of the box. So you're talking about the game, you're talking about the story, you're talking about character arcs. So as you can see, we're getting a little more detail now. We're injecting a bit more of the game's theming into it. The target audience, again, we're getting more detailed. Who is this game for? How long do you expect it to be? It's good to reference other titles or media, in this case, a movie called Quest for Camelot, for those who know it, and then Prince of Persia, which I'm sure you are all aware of. And then we go into our key features, or it could be your design pillars. We don't have design pillars in our vision template just because we don't. There's no real reason for that. I have a separate document for it. But here, again, we start to get even more detailed. So we go into more detail about what the story is. We go into more detail about the gameplay. So where before we said there were 2 playable characters, each with their own abilities, now we're assigning abilities to characters. So the knight is combat focused and the princess is puzzle focused. So again, we're getting even more and more detailed, more and more specific. And then there's a conclusion at the end to once again wrap up your thoughts in a nice bow. And then to get even more detail, we go into specifications. So what platforms are you aiming for? What genre are you aiming for? What rating do you want, ideally? How long do you think the campaign will be? Multiplayer, yes, no, locations. Again, you get even more detail than the concept overview, where there we said there were levels and a hub. We didn't say how many, we didn't define how many. This is where you start defining. And in our case, our levels are tied directly to the story. So we fleshed out the narrative before we assigned locations or levels to chunks of the story. So that's how we did ours, for example. So there's these are two documents with two different purposes. So your concept overview is kind of like your design Bible. So you have to check it when you're designing features or when you're building stuff out. And then your vision template is more of a pitch deck and a way to help you scope. So you can use it to pitch because there's a lot of information in there, but then you can also use it to scope because that's where you've defined how many levels you have, what would the characters be doing, things like that, how long the game is. So both documents together act as your foundation. So now I want to talk about MDA, which is a framework some of you may know. And then I want to talk about design and mechanics, but I want to go through MDA first because it's going to help you improve your documentation and streamline the process a fair amount. So MDA stands for Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics. It's one of the most powerful tools for evaluating whether a feature is worth building. So mechanics are the rules and systems. So what can the player do? The dynamics is the runtime behavior. So what does the player do? And then the aesthetics are the emotional experience of the players. What do they feel? And it matters a lot for documentation and especially for iteration. It's very important. So I want to show you with Devil May Cry's style system how MDA kind of works. So the mechanic is a style meter that grades your combat performance in real time from D to triple S. And repeating the same move, for example, drops your rank. Getting hit drops your rank. There's a lot of things there. Players are mechanically rewarded. So the dynamics, players are mechanically rewarded for varying combos. So you can't just spam one move. And this creates an emergent behavior where players experiment with the toolkit and with all the different weapons and techniques to maintain that high rank. And then the aesthetic is that they feel self-expression, they feel mastery, they feel stylish and skilled, especially when they maintain an S rank or get that perfect block. And they feel creative pressure to keep mixing it up. So if you look at the chain, the mechanic creates a behavior which generates a targeted emotion. And the reason I picked this feature or this mechanic, which is a weird one, is because I want to show you that the aesthetic or the emotion doesn't just have to be happy, angry, sad. It can be a feeling, like feeling cool. It doesn't have to be an emotion necessarily. Now I want to show you something very powerful with MDA, and how the same core mechanic can completely provide different aesthetics through its implementation. So both Dark Souls and Mario have a jump. But if we look at Dark Souls, the mechanic of the jump is you have to jump while sprinting. There's a fixed arc. You have minimal air control, no precision adjustments midair. There's a slow acceleration into the jump. And so that causes people to avoid jumping when possible. It's used only for traversal, not combat, and only when necessary. Players feel very risky and they feel like they need to commit. And then players end up planning every jump very carefully. And so the aesthetics is that players feel tense. They feel like they need to be deliberate. And when they've succeeded in their jump, they feel relief. Now, if we go to Super Mario, you can jump anytime with variable height, so you have control. You have a lot of air control. Your momentum is preserved from your speed, so from when you're running, and the response is instant. So what this leads players to do is they jump all the time. It's very fluid. They can use it for expression. They can use it in combat. They can use it for exploration. Jumping feels safe and responsive, so they do it a lot. And players experiment with the jump freely because there's very little downside to it. And so the emotions end up being joy, freedom. They feel like they're in the flow. They feel rhythmic. They feel mastery, especially when they do some of those crazier jumps. So the core mechanic is the same. You press a button to jump, but the implementation details create a completely different player experience. So this is why documenting both mechanics, expected dynamics, and the desired aesthetics is crucial. If you just write the player can jump, your programmer might implement the Dark Souls jump when you actually wanted a Mario jump, or vice versa. So when you document using NDA, you're capturing the intent of your design, not just the implementation. So how do you use MDA? So when you start documenting a feature, let's say crafting, you ask what are the mechanics. So gather materials, combine them in a menu, create items. You ask yourself what the dynamics are. Well, probably resource management, some backtracking when you want like a specific item, economy balancing. And then you have to ask yourself, do those dynamics create the target aesthetic? Is it serving the emotion you want the player to feel in your game, in your design? And if you can't answer step 3, then you should stop documenting your mechanic, because you need to figure out what the core idea is before you spend time on it. Basically, you're creating documentation for your documentation. So this framework, coupled with the documents we saw above, really helps prevent scope creep, and it gives you a principled way to say no to features that don't serve the game's core experience. So you don't have to argue with anyone. You can go, look, based on what we agreed upon, I don't think this will work. And when you document using MDA and you explain not just what a feature is, but why it exists and how it serves your aesthetics, your team understands the intent, not just the implementation. So that can help them provide you with better ideas or help you plus your design, or it's just easier for them to make because they know why they're making it. So now let's talk about mechanics and features and how to document those. Again, very important to do. So beyond the 2 documents we spoke about above, every feature should live in its own dedicated page. And so your page should be structured roughly like this. You should have a context, so why the feature exists. So again, this is a sentence or 2 about why the feature is necessary and how it relates to your design pillars or your concept overview or your vision template. And this should tie everything back down to your foundation. Then you should run your design through MDA, not only for you to see if it's worth documenting, which is why it's up top, but also when your team members come in, they understand what the intent is, they understand what you're trying to make and why you're trying to make it. And finally, measuring success. So it's important to write down how you plan to test the feature or what metrics you're looking for to consider it a success. What behaviors are you expecting? It could be just as simple as I wanted to hit the target aesthetic of the MDA above. Doesn't have to be anything too crazy, but it's a place for you to put down your design goals. After this, we get into specifics. So going back to the pyramid, the section above is your base, is your foundation. This is what I think the design should be. This section is when you start getting specific, you start putting some details in. So in your specifications is where your design lives. So you need to write down a detailed summary of how the feature works. So you can include images, sketches, what the player will see and do step by step. And you need to be specific because the player presses X to jump is much better than the player can jump. Going back to the Dark Souls and Mario, you want to make sure you're designing the jump that your game needs. And this section should at all costs avoid paragraphs. There should be a set of instructions on how your design works. So I personally use, and I recommend using bullet points for any and all text found in the specification section. Sketches are the best thing, but if you need to put in text, it should be in a bullet point format. The next section here is a section for flow charts. Some things are better explained charts like UI or menus. Section, and the same with that. There's a table for that, and again, it helps the programmer when they're implementing it. They don't have to put in a random value. There are values that they can pull from, and it can save. It just saves time. With regards to the flowchart and the value section, it may not be applicable to every design you have. So in order to maintain clarity and to streamline, again, documentation and your whole process, if you don't use it, I suggest you just remove it completely. Just delete it from your feature page. And then finally, just again, looking at the pyramid, we're moving up to the top. So now we're getting very specific. We're trying to lock things down. there's a section for edge cases. So where in the game and at what point does your design need to behave differently? Like what happens if a player jumps when they're on a moving platform? That can be different from game to game. Do you want the player to be locked to that moving platform? Do you want them not to be? This is where you would put that in. Research and testing is how you're going to research your design. So this isn't the most useful for single player games, but this section is especially important for online experiences. So you can specify when a feature should be tested locally, when it should be tested on the server, when you want to roll it out for a play test. So and again, online experience benefit from this a lot. If you're making a single player game, it is good to document how you want your feature to be tested. Although I think a better way to do that is with a test plan. But again, if you're not making an online game and you are using this template that I'll provide at the end, if you're not using research and testing, delete it. It just keeps the document clean. So why do single pages work? So they keep each mechanic self-contained. So you avoid the everything's connected, everything breaks problem that a giant GDD has. Programmers can work from a feature page alone without sifting through unrelated design notes. If something changes, you can update that one page. The rest of the documentation remains intact. And every time your wiki over time, your wiki becomes like a living map of your entire game's logic. And speaking of a living map, let's talk about living documents real quick. So this is a design document for our moving platform in the game. The one on the left we made very early on, and the one on the right is one we made about a month ago, I think, at this point. So if we look at the one on the left, you can see that we've captured that the levels will feature moving platforms. They'll float in the environment, and they can move in any direction. They can rotate, and the parameters should be adjustable. It's very simple. That's our core idea. But it was enough, even though it was very simple, to start designing levels around the concept and for the programmer to start thinking about how to implement it and how to create the design tools for the level designer to use. And as the project progressed, and I looked to my team for specifics, and the document changed and again specificity. So from just implementation details, it went all the way to visual design. So the right side has animation details. It has our visual design, configurable parameters that I think would be beneficial, movement systems. But if you look closely, the core is still present. So the movement system section hasn't changed much. We didn't throw away the original and start over. We built on top of it. And so this is what a living document is. This is what living documentation means, and this is what your wiki page should be. You start with what you know, and then you add details as you learn. So the foundation always stays stable while the details evolve. And as the details evolve and you start to get specific, then those, you start to log those in. This prevented us from having to restart. We had a clear record of our original intent and how it evolved. And this loops back, to hierarchical thinking. We defined our core and then got specific as we built upon our foundation. And as we build out the models that we'll actually need, we'll start to lock that in. So I just want to go over some practical rules and some closing thoughts. So the 5-minute rule. So this is a rule that can save you hours. Once you've done your documentation, mechanic, concept overview, whatever it is, before you send out the page for other people to look at, just ask yourself, will this question come up? If the answer is yes, then spend 5 minutes documenting it. And will you be able to predict every possible question asked? No, but that's fine. So that's why when you sit down with your team or someone else to review the document or to walk someone through the document, take note of any questions they have and then spend 5 minutes documenting each one in the document itself. So it's clear, again, everything's updated, everyone's on the same page. So there is a harsh truth. And the harsh truth is, if you can't document your design, you probably don't understand your design. So if you can't explain how a system works in writing and you have a vague feeling, not a specification. So design documentation isn't a suggestion, it's a blueprint. It needs detailing and it needs respecting, again, from everyone, from the person that writes it all the way to the person implementing it. Documentation helps everyone as well. I touched upon this a bit, but it helps the people building the game, it helps the people testing the game, and it helps the people selling the game. If everyone understands the vision, it makes sure that everyone's pulling in the same direction. So beyond game design, so I focus a lot on game design today, but there's so much that needs documenting: narrative, procedures, bugs, production schedules. I didn't even go into everything you can document in game design. There's a lot. But if you're going to document one thing, I suggest it be your game's core design, which would be the concept overview document, vision template, and then all your features should be documented, ideally. So the key takeaways from today's talk is documentation. Hopefully, I've impressed upon you this infrastructure, not overhead. It's going to help your team build faster. It's going to reduce bottlenecks, rework, and it's going to let everyone work in parallel. Wikis work where monolithic GDDs fail. Modular, searchable, updatable pages that teams can actually use benefit everyone, as opposed to a large Word document that no one wants to read or update. And if you want to start with documentation, which I hope you do, start with the concept overview, move into the vision template, and then build your feature pages from there. So our example is, as I mentioned, we created a fully playable level in 6 months, plus a couple extra levels that are halfway done using these exact techniques. So documentation didn't slow us down. It's the only reason we could move this fast. If you want to follow our progress, you can check out Secrets of the Bow of Victoria's Quest on Steam. We'd be happy to have you. So that is it for today. So thank you for listening. I hope it wasn't too boring. And then here I have, so there'll be some Q&A time, I think. Yes, there will be. And this QR code will take you to the templates. So the templates will be the concept overview, vision template, and mechanics and feature template. And this link will take you to a Notion board where you can either, if you use Notion, duplicate it directly into your workflow, or you can copy paste everything and put it into Word or whatever your team is using to document their process. If you don't have any documentation or any processes in place, I do very highly recommend Notion. I think it's very good. It's very free, has a lot of tools. If you have any questions after this or after today, you can find all my contact details at kevinasler.car.co. Otherwise, I'm also in the Indie Game Business Discord. So that is that. That's all from me.
Great job. See, I told you would do perfect. I'm going to leave this Q&A template up for a few more seconds, and then I'm going to pop it down. We do actually have a few questions for you. So, all right. I think that was long enough. So we're going to go with this one first. So on YouTube from Bedhead Studios, what's a good way for us to properly finalize a deadline when the core elements are agreed upon, especially for a new team learning to work together for the first time with individual schedules?
Yes, so that's a good question. Once you've detailed your core elements, the next thing you need to do is move into more of a production mindset, and you need to sit down with everyone and you need to ask people, how long will this thing take? How long will that thing take? And when you are working with a part-time team, as I am, you need to be flexible, but hopefully everyone's also on the same page and everyone wants to make the game. So what I tend to do is, once we've defined our core and we have a couple feature pages set up, because that's what people will be building off of, I'll sit down with the program and say, okay, moving platform, how long do you think it'll take? And they'll say, okay, I think it'll take me 2 days. And I go, okay, but you're actually working Monday to Friday. So if you only do weekends, how long do you think that would take? And they'll go, a week. And so that's how you should plan things out. Same thing with the artist. How long do you think it'll take? And then once they give you the answer, you go, but how long will it actually take? taken into account all these things. And, things will happen. People will be delayed. But if everyone knows what they're making, it just helps speed everything along. And then hopefully one day, that's our hope, we'll get some funding and everyone can be full-time, and we'll be like a bullet train. No one can stop us then.
Awesome. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next question. So on YouTube from Maggie McLean, loving this. In your experience, what's a good cadence between designing, iterating a design, approving the design, and implementation to ensure that there's always design to work from?
So in this case, I had the chance to design a lot of stuff up front by myself. So game development, in my opinion, is very design heavy up front. But a good cadence would be to design as much as you can, focusing just on the core. Going back to the pyramid. If your game was purely cubes, what needs to be made? So that's a good question to ask yourself. The characters are cube, the environment's a cube, moving platforms are a cube. If everything's a cube, what needs to be made? And that should be the first thing you document. Running it through MDA as well. What do I want this cube to make players feel? It's a very important question. And the truth is, if your cube is fun, then all the art, all of the special effects you add on will just plus the fun cube. So what we do is, as with the document I showed, I make sure that I document the core and I give that out. And as that's being worked on, then I either, depending on what the feature is, I either look to my artist and I go, okay, this is a moving platform, but I think it's boring if it's just a floating rock. What do we do? And then in our case, what we're gonna do, because we need to do it, is it'll be this giant fairy that kind of swims through the air and you land on its head. It's like a big flower fairy. And so while the program is working on implementation, I've spoken to the artist. I've added that into the document because I think that's important. We're going to do the flower fairy thing. And then I go to the animator. So it's going to move. How should it move? Oh, it should be like swimming through the air. Put that in the document. So by the time the program has finished the core implementation, he can look and go, okay, so it's not a static mesh, it's a skeletal mesh. What we use Unreal. It's a skeletal mesh. It's going to need an animation blueprint. So he can start on that. Meanwhile, the artist is creating the skeletal mesh. The animator's most likely working on a different character, but it kind of needs to chain into itself. And the only way you can do that is by working hierarchically, and you go big picture, details, lock it in.
All right, next step. We have Alonzo on YouTube. A typical issue teams run into is design docs getting outdated as time goes on. Have you run into this? If so, how do you recommend avoiding it? Or maybe is it okay at certain stages of the project?
So I haven't run into it just because I'm a real stickler for documentation. And also going back to Notion, the fact that if I need to update something, I go in and I add a couple lines and everyone has it is really helpful. It kind of helps promote updating a document because it's easy, it's simple. Notion also has a lot of tools to make it look nice, which for some designers is important. Now, is there a stage in development where your design doc could be out of date? Technically speaking, at the beginning, all of your documentation is out of date because, as I showed with the moving platform, the initial sketch that I did, it was just a floating rock, and that was out of date immediately because I knew I didn't want that. So your documents, there will be sections and there will be times throughout development where it becomes out of date, but you also need to be respectful of the document. As I mentioned, it's a blueprint, it's what everyone's is following or should be following. And so you need to respect it. You need to give it time the same way a 3D artist gives it time to their 3D model. A designer needs to give time to their documents. I know nowadays it's very common for you to be hired as a game designer, but you're kind of set up to make blueprints or to do things in engine. But as I mentioned, looking at the construction industry, a designer is an architect. Your job is to document, your job is to follow your documentation through to final implementation. So it needs to be respected. If you have documents that are out of date, you have to take the extra time to deal with it.
Awesome. Thank you. We only have like a minute left, but I wanted to bring up Bedhead Studios again. So they said in response to the question that you answered for them, that's how we feel. My project manager and I are in here working to soak up knowledge. We'll try individual meetings. We're hoping for funding someday so we can full time and knock this out.
Yeah, that's the dream. That's
Yeah.
our dream too. Yeah. I mean, I have the absolute pleasure to have a team that is very talented, very fast. That's also one of the reasons, I'll be honest, we were able to move so quickly in 6 months is they have all the talent that I lack in their departments, but I've given them the map, so they just move. And yeah, well, if we could get funding, it'd be, like I said, we'd be a bullet train.
Well, Kevin, thank you so very much for all
Well,
of your
thank you.
insight today. You did awesome. I knew you would. So,
Thank
guys,
you.
if you just hang tight on YouTube, we'll be back next with Anatoly and their talk on production pipeline of a one developer studio with 50 million plus downloads. So, thank you for tuning in today, guys. We'll be here until 5 p.m. Eastern. Every hour on the hour will be a new talk. So stay put and we'll be back. Thank you again, Kevin.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
All right. Bye, guys.